So we're going to now be joined by the panel. Our wonderful newish, I think it's just a few weeks old, Sarah Waladan, who's our new Director of Policy and Regulatory Affairs, is going to be leading this panel for a discussion on the research, but overall data and privacy. I'll hand over to you, Sarah.
Thanks, Gay, and thanks, Kirsten and David, for excellent presentations. Very interesting. And welcome also to Gabbi Stubbs from Adobe, Moritz from Sanden from Audience 360, and Greg Kearney from Suncorp. So as Gay mentioned, this research has, of course, been perfectly timed. The government's long-awaited privacy review has literally just been released yesterday, which is looking at a range of potential reforms that go to its scope and enforceability, and also whether the existing framework is practical and proportionate for promoting good privacy practices. Along with this review, the government also yesterday released a second review, which was recommended as an outcome of the recent digital platforms inquiry, proposing draft legislation to introduce a privacy code of conduct specifically for social media companies, data brokerage services, and also large companies, essentially online platforms of at least 2.5 million users. So essentially companies that are seen as collecting large volumes of data. The Privacy Act, of course, already requires organisations to be transparent about the data they collect, how they collect it, and the purposes for which they use it. However, the current reviews are intended to look more closely at recent research reports and findings, including the ACCC's digital platforms and ad tech inquiries, and consider whether existing laws are fit for purpose in the context of new and emerging technologies, as well as online data practices and the collection of large data sets. And this, of course, is occurring in the context of similar reviews around the world, including countries like the UK, which essentially now looks like it's stepping back a bit from some of the stricter requirements of the GDPR when it comes to issues like consent requests and pop-ups. And so for anyone who's getting a bit concerned listening to this in terms of the process, there are several steps to go before anything comes into law. So the legislation first needs to go through the government consultation process and be introduced and pass the Parliament before the process for developing a code can even begin. So while the first consultation period is due to finish in December, we won't be seeing a code anytime before the election. So a bit of time still there. But we will be providing a bit of a more detailed summary about these reviews on the IAB website. We'll do that sort of in the coming week or so, and we'll also liaise with our members as we go through the papers. So to bring it back to what we're here to talk about today, the Ipsos data is really timely as it builds on our understanding of how consumers think about privacy, what their main concerns and expectations are, and ultimately how we need to go about balancing consumer privacy on the one hand with a workable and sustainable digital economy on the other. These are, of course, often seen as competing interests that privacy law somehow needs to balance, but ultimately we all want the same thing. We want to be able to engage online confidently, knowing that our personal information will be protected, but without too many annoying pop-ups and unnecessary consent requests that essentially slow everything down. So I will bring in our panel at this point. Gabbi, perhaps the most surprising data point in this research is the lack of understanding of the fact that advertising pays for free access to content online. Why is it important for the industry that consumers understand the data exchange that occurs with online platforms?
Yes, thanks, Sarah. It was particularly interesting research. I think most of us sort of suspected some of it. The reality is, though, is that one of the biggest misconceptions is that the internet is free, when we know that in reality, you know, data is the currency that consumers pay for in exchange for the promise of products, experiences, and as Kirsten pointed out, things like rewards and loyalties and discounts, etc. And for most of those, specifically, the more tailored they are and the more unique the needs and the preferences are, obviously, the more that, you know, they need to be able to be very specific and tailorized or unique and more data required. So that consumer data is really central to offering, effective customer experiences that really cater to those, consuming customer needs. But I think if we think very specifically, I can think of three, reasons why I think it's pretty important for us to be able to understand that value exchange, and it came out in that research as well. So I think first and foremost, the reason it really matters is that without a fundamental understanding of the value exchange, consumers will not trust brands to be able to share their data with them in the first place. And if we're moving to a space where fundamentally a large portion of that data is first-party data, so it's either initiated by a consumer or it's passively sought, those things are the things that are actually going to fuel really great experiences moving forward. And what we also know from research that we've done is that value exchange is also very much a virtuous loop. So the more data that consumers provide, the more value-filled experiences should come with those. But in turn, a brand's credibility really improves in the eyes of consumers with better experiences. So a really strong, trusted, trust-based relationship with consumers is the key to a really sustainable, effective data and especially first-party data strategy. And that strong value proposition really helps demonstrate the value of the data relationship. I think as an industry, the obvious place why it's important, secondly, is, those effective first-party data strategies are really just good business, especially moving forward. As I said, there are important implications for, business as usual, things from measurement insights, things that David talked about, segmentation, targeting, media effectiveness, etc., but also around revenue sustainability, innovation, trade, investment growth, all of those kind of things. But I think it's critical to understand that, those superior customer experiences are really one of the few remaining means of sustainable competitive advantage in a world where everyone does have really solid access to data. So invariably, those data and those customer experiences are delivered by that first party, data, and it's obviously being delivered on the backbone of a solid value exchange. And I think, lastly, that sort of the third area is probably, around equity. It's very much a really discussed sort of consequence, sort of like a choice in value exchange that we're really starting to see play out in digital at the moment. So I think, appealing to people's better angels, I think within the industry, we should really think really long and hard about who we exclude from critical services when we place, an incorrect balance on, the value exchange, for example. And a really great example is where we over-index on subscription-based access to content, and that will really supercharge, digital divide. And I think my concern here is very specifically around, elements like news. And so what we have is a scenario where those who can afford news, they'll have access to quality, accurate, varied information and opinions. And so it really becomes a luxury item. And those who can't are much more likely to be subjected to increasingly more misinformation, or at the very least, certainly lacking diversity and depth of content. So that value exchange is absolutely of critical importance from a societal perspective. I think from there, it's not simply a nice to have. And that news and access to information should really be available to everyone, regardless of, your ability to pay. So advertising really is a means to be able to fund that access in the absence of a direct user pay arrangements, I guess. So that's probably my three.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Yeah, and the data shows that when presented with options for funding models, advertising was supported more than others. So perhaps that's related. Moritz, perhaps if I can bring you in, what does this tell us, and why is it important for consumers that services remain free? And as an industry, do we need to better educate consumers on how we go about this?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. I guess to Gabby's point, it really just shows that consumers don't know, right? They want to have their cookie and eat it too, to use a terrible anecdote. But they really don't know what is the actual privacy that they're giving up and what is the value that they're exchanging as well. So, if consumers don't truly understand where the data is going or what's happening with it, how can they even understand what they're giving up? And to Gabby's point around, this fair access of the internet, I guess to me, the internet is a bit of a, equality space where everyone should have equal rights. And sometimes that's to a fault with fake news, but, all the amazing content that's available for free, right, as the standard consumer thinks it is, really is made available by advertising and through this industry. So, this whole privacy conversation is really driven by two massive companies, and, Apple and Google, really under the guise of privacy, always striking fear into consumers, kind of pushing this narrative that these advertisers want your data, they want to follow you around, they want to do all these things, but it's really Apple and Google that are doing that. I think so. As an industry, we need to do a better job of standing up against, Apple and Google, calling it out, educating internally as well, really calling out transparency and not just accepting Google as the status quo. So we need to educate ourselves as an industry before we can even start having that conversation with consumers.
Very interesting. And so, Greg, we've heard about the importance of advertising to fund content. What about personalisation of advertising? Why is data collection for personalisation important, and how does that enhance the consumer experience?
Well, Sarah, providing relevant information, relevant messaging, I should say, to the right audience is a real fundamental component of what we're trying to achieve as marketers, and anonymised consented data sharing helps us do that better. To give an obvious example of first-party data sharing, common practice is probably suppression. So there's nothing worse than going on a website, transacting and purchasing a goods or service, and then being followed by that brand around the internet for the next couple of weeks, even though you've just bought it. So suppression, sort of overcomes that and allows you to remove existing customers from your targeting. So that's a good customer experience, but also has a commercial benefit for us through efficiencies. Sorry, go on.
No, you finish first, and then I'll move on to sharing data with third parties.
Sorry, did you ask about the education piece, or was that?
Yeah, if you want to answer that, yeah.
Sure. Yeah, so I think we're going to talk about the need to educate consumers on personalisation.
Yep.
Well, I think with that one, I'm not sure if we need to educate the consumers on personalisation, because if it's done well, it should be of a benefit to them, and should feel like a smooth process and not really dredge anything up. Whereas where we come into issues if we see examples of over or under personalisation, i.e. bad targeting. So perhaps I think it's some marketers that need education on personalisation more than the consumers. No one really wants to read their license plate details on an MREC when they're being served an insurance ad for their car.
Yeah, very good point. Thank you, everyone. Moving on to the issue of companies sharing their data with third parties. So the survey data again showed that consumers really don't feel comfortable with this. The second most important thing that companies can do to make consumers feel more comfortable in sharing their information is essentially to stop doing this, is what it found. David, we hear about, the nightmare stories when things go wrong, like with Cambridge Analytica. Are there legitimate reasons for sharing data with third parties?
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. I think I was appalled by the Cambridge Analytica story. For people listening in, I encourage you to watch the TED Talk that The Guardian did. It was on Brexit. It was incredible, and it goes beyond anything else that I've heard. I think if we look back to the research, I was particularly interested in where 69% of people didn't make that correlation between the fact that free content is typically financed by ads. And I'm very happy to hear that they were supportive of that model. I passionately believe that businesses have the right to work with companies to better improve their experiences, and be it data, be it technology, be it financial, in order to get that competitive advantage to ensure that they can deliver the best possible experience and ensure that they can perform some tasks that are technically perhaps hard for them to do internally, that they could seek out the best possible capability from global companies or others to ensure that they can compete in that environment. I think it's important to recognise as well and be very specific on consent-based data, making sure that it's easy to opt out and that it's easy to be removed and forgotten. I think if you look at Australia, it has a long history of good consumer protection. So I expect the ACCC will have done a lot of homework on GDPR in terms of not just from a law, but also how it's implemented, how it's policed. If you look at how it's been policed in different markets, France are probably the most progressive in actually taking people to court and making a statement. And if you look at the three largest GDPR violations in the last 2 years, they've come from Amazon, Facebook, and Google. Of course, some brands have made poor decisions, but I really do believe that in Australia, the ACCC will be looking at GDPR and to ensure that they make the best possible solution for Australia. And I think that through that, there will be the relevant protections to ensure that Aussies are protected.
Yeah, the ACCC is definitely looking at these issues very closely, isn't it? Gabbi, can sharing data with third parties be done safely?
Yeah, so look, I think the short answer is yes. It happens significantly more than it doesn't. So I think we should really remember that most organisations operate relatively incident-free when it comes to data management and data sharing. But those large, infrequent incidents tend to create the perception that it's really widespread or prolific. But I want to be really clear. Obviously, whilst there are guidelines, there are laws, there are regulations, the way that policies and the way that data is handled in itself differs from industry to industry, from business to business, and as we said, from region to region, but also even across departments within organisations. And so even although there are best practices to follow across each of those sort of dimensions to be able to reduce that list, nothing is foolproof. So prevention is really only as good as the humans and the policies that actually govern it. And I guess in that respect, it is actually no riskier to share data across organisations than it is to share across your own internal teams. And I think it's also to some of the points that have been made, as well. Even creating mega corporations or platforms that are really, vertically integrated or wholly integrated isn't necessarily going to ensure, greater privacy or minimize the risk necessarily around around data sharing. It provides the same risk and the same opportunity as sharing across an organization or across businesses, separate businesses. And I think, from our perspective, from an Adobe perspective, obviously really good market leading technology plays a critical role in this piece around data sharing. But safety is not reliant on the technology alone, as I've just pointed out. Outside of just your policies, you have to think about, the rigor and certainly the combination of things like compliance to regulations, like your approaches to data management, and also identity resolution, which David talked about beforehand, around your systems, around your processes, and even around your people. So I think the one thing that I'd really say is, from a practical level, is that each of these really requires adequate flexibility as much as robustness as well. So you need to be able to not only be really solid and have comprehensive elements of all of those, but you need to be able to adjust to the changing conditions and regulations and consumer requirements. So that agility is really important here. But I think going back to what some of the research also said as well in the background, at a really, a lot more holistic level, customer centricity is absolutely key here. When you put consumer preferences and consumer permissions, I should say, and those preferences front and center, it really enables a lot of those things to work in harmony. So the tech and the systems and processes, but also the company culture of a business, making it all more holistically, a little more safe. So effectively what I'm saying is, when initiatives really give customers control, over their collection, the data, the storage, the use, the deletion of their data, whatever it might be, it helps minimize the exposure and the exploitation of personal data, regardless of whether you're sharing within a business or across organizations. So I guess you really you minimize the possibility of falling foul when those tech practices are respectful and comprehensive. And I think the other thing to keep in mind as well is that if all of those things are based on a center of trust, and when we're empowering consumers to it gives them a lot more confidence and ends up with a lot more loyalty around that when we're transparent, etc. What we've also found is that in the event of an actual data breach, heaven forbid, customers are actually significantly more forgiving, which is probably quite ironic. But at the same time, if you've built that center of trust and you're doing things and they understand that you're doing things from a respectful position, they are actually significantly more forgiving if things do inadvertently go wrong, which they probably may do.
Great points. Transparency and control is so important, and we will come back to that a little bit more in terms of the research in a minute as well. Moritz, why is it important for companies to be able to share data with third parties?
Yeah, I mean, it really comes down to what a company's good at. What is their mission statement? What is their actual goal? So I guess to use real world example for me, it's Audience 360 works with Webjet, and Webjet's goal is to, bring discounted flights to consumers, give consumers choice. Their expertise isn't in audience targeting. I guess that's where we come in. And then even further from there, we have to work with, someone like Gabbi to segment those audiences. Then we have to work with the DSP to activate those audiences. It really, to me, isn't so much a case of them saying, stop sharing my information with a third party, as it is saying, stop sharing information about me with companies that I don't know how they work, what they do. So this whole transparency thing really shines through in that context. And I guess this is where advertising really shoots itself in the foot sometimes, right? So with such a great industry of innovation and progress and bringing new technology to the market and all these different kind of things. But really what we're seeing over the last couple of years is further and further this deep dive into machine learning, artificial intelligence, and black boxes and snake oil and magic mystery data and all these kind of things that are confusing to us, right? Everyone on this call would go, I actually don't know how a lot of these things work, but they have data in them somehow. And if we don't understand, how can any sort of consumer really understand? I guess this is kind of where we start looking at what we as an industry can do to change that. And, if there's kind of one big thing that I always kind of ask everyone to take away is if you can't draw where data comes from and the underlying privacy consent, and then where it goes out on a piece of paper with simple lines, and you can explain that journey to, your friends, your family, your parents, who struggle to sometimes turn on a laptop. If you can't explain that in the most simple terms, then of course the consumer isn't going to trust where that data goes. So they're just calling it third parties, but really what they're asking for is much greater transparency.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just mindful of time as well. So just quickly on transparency and control before we go to a last point on brand trust. No real huge surprises in terms of transparency and control from the data. 81% of consumers want more control and choice. 74% they said they choose at least sometimes not to deal with an organisation because of onerous consent requests and pop-ups. At the same time, on tracking, people are more comfortable or at least aware of tracking than we previously thought. Perhaps if we can keep the responses pretty short on this one. Gabbi, what do you think this is telling us?
Yeah, look, I think, we've done research on exactly the same thing, and it's interesting, it bears out almost exactly the same as what Kirsten suggested. So, invariably, transparency leads to trust, but it actually isn't enough. We need, to build those trusted relationships, you need both transparency and greater consumer control. And there's a massive distinction between when customers think they're delivering trust and when consumers actually, when companies do. Companies tend to think that if they disclose, that's enough, whereas consumers really want to be able to get that in the background. I think, there's a piece that sits around being really great digital citizens as well. We tend to think about things like, 4 C's, for example, provide clarity, provide choice, consent and compliance. But I think the other thing to be able to do to get a balance in is that you should be treating consent management, for example, the same as what you do treat every other customer experience engagement. Make it, involve the marketing team, not just the legal team and the CPOs, and actually make it a good experience for customers to actually ensure that you reduce some of that friction out of it.
Yeah. And Greg, on personalisation and tracking, are consumers becoming more used to tracking over time, perhaps because of COVID?
Perhaps. I think it still comes back to the value exchange, though. There's got to be a benefit for the individual, and then if there is, they'll be more open to it. The COVID example, there was a pretty innate benefit in playing their part in managing the pandemic. So that was quite an easy one to get. So I think it's still about the value exchange there.
Thank you. And Moritz, just finally on transparency and control, there's something becoming known as dark patterns in UX circles. What are these, just very briefly, and how do organisations avoid these types of misuses of data?
Yeah, so essentially dark pattern is something that's specifically designed to get a user to take an action that they normally wouldn't if they were fully aware of what was being asked of them. And they've been around for ages, right? Early internet is you're the millionth visitor to this website, click here, give your details, win a trip to Fiji, those kind of things. But as with everything on the internet, it's become more and more sophisticated. And in the last couple of days, we've learned from unsealed court documents out of the States around something called Project Nira from Google, which essentially kind of devolves their dark secret of how they're tricking users into signing up to everything Google, everything Chrome, to create this walled garden. And it's allegations at the moment, but those are really kind of the darkest of patterns around the internet at the moment. If people are being tricked into giving up the information, especially if you're considering that 74% of people are saying that they're avoiding pop-ups, yet everyone's happily using Google tools, and all of that information kind of goes out there. It again shows that we need to have that transparency as an industry. And it is a massive risk to the internet. It's a massive risk to the free internet if there's two companies that control everything. It's a risk to publishers. It's also a risk to brands, because if there's only two companies that actually can give them internet advertising, they're not going to be the best products. Competition breeds better products. And so, it all sounds very dramatic on my end. But really, I would say that everyone on this call and everyone who listens to this really should have a look at what they're doing, what their practices are. Are they being transparent? Are they being moral? Are they being ethical? And are they actually moving advertising forward, or are they hindering it? So to me, it really comes down to, can you be transparent with the data? And if not, then don't plan it, don't sell it, don't use it, don't risk it, basically.
Thank you. And that leads us very nicely into the last point, which I think is a good one to finish on. The data shows that ultimately people tend to be more comfortable giving their data to brands they trust. So trust goes well beyond consent notices and across the entirety of consumers' interactions with the brand on and offline. Greg, and then perhaps anyone else who wants to jump in, brand safety and consumer trust are huge in advertising. There's a huge reputational risk to your brand if you get it wrong. Ultimately, does this sufficiently incentivize privacy compliance? Are companies that have strong privacy protections in place more likely to receive the benefit of their consumers' trust?
Yeah, look, I think it's hard to say. For Suncorp, absolutely. We've got robust data governance and policies in place to ensure we're compliant, but also protecting our customers and making sure they understand consent. But there are plenty of other less regulated industries, plenty of other businesses who might see a commercial upside in bending the rules, or perhaps facing consequences after their commercial upside for doing whatever they want to do. So I think it depends, but it's definitely not a one size fits all in terms of that. But I would say that, as awareness and understanding of privacy and consent grows in the general public, it's just going to have a bigger and bigger effect, for good or bad. Brands that are adhering are going to really reap the benefits of it, and those that don't are going to really suffer. And trust is such an important pillar of brand health now that it's just going to be becoming more and more important.
Well said. Anyone else want to jump in on that one?
No, I think as I said, we've done similar research, Sarah, and as I said beforehand, trust is very much the centerpiece of that consumer experience, I think, moving forward. And as you start to get that virtuous loop happening, your credibility does improve with those experiences. So the better you are with that digital practice and the transparency and control, etc., the better it will pay off in terms of that brand credibility.
Absolutely.
Thank you. And thank you, panel. That was a fantastic discussion. Back to you, Gay.
Thank you all. I knew that would be a great group of people and could have chatted all day.